Recording. Hey, all right, welcome to FedRAMP's Vulnerability Management Special Event. So first of all, typical disclaimers for FedRAMP events apply. You can see these at fedramp.gov/disclaimers. The key thing for today is that all the information that you're going to hear today is for the convenience of the public, and none of this conversation, discussion, etc., serves as an endorsement or support directly from GSA for any of the businesses mentioned here today. All right. Why are we here? What are we here to talk about? FedRAMP, a couple of weeks ago, released RFC-12 on the Continuous Vulnerability Management Standard. A year ago, FedRAMP was basically rebuilt by government policy under OMB Memorandum M2415, where the previous FedRAMP was rescinded and replaced with a new FedRAMP. A key aspect of this new FedRAMP was to really lean into the best practices that high quality commercial cloud service providers follow for security and monitoring, managing vulnerabilities, etc. In the past, FedRAMP had relied on a somewhat generic old kind of approach that involved basic scans at regular intervals with incredibly long remediation timelines. And really, I would say maybe over-indexing on the concept of remediation, meaning as long as you had a red box on a scan, you had to fix that red box and it was a problem. RFC 12 is attempting to take a real technical risk management approach to how we think cloud service providers should go about doing security right when it comes to vulnerability management. A key aspect of that is enabling context. Context matters for a vulnerability. If a vulnerability exists on a system that doesn't connect to anything else, then it is less important than a low-risk vulnerability on something that allows access to anything and everywhere. So we wanted to signal with this draft policy that FedRAMP wants to take a more aggressive security-based approach. The intent of that policy as written is to show where we want to take the program. Today, it is unacceptable to have internet reachable vulnerabilities that are not mitigated as quickly as possible. Average time to exploit for some of these can get down to like days. We see this this week, topical, this tool shell where there's just like still a week and a half into this event with SharePoint exploits. There are still things on the internet that are getting exploited. Totally unacceptable. They should be mitigated. So we want to really push into that, and we're really excited to kind of see how that's going to affect businesses and help folks do security better. Today, we wanted to talk with a bunch of really good best-in-class companies about how they're doing security right now to understand and hear how that aligns with where FedRAMP wants to go, where in some cases current businesses are far ahead of us, and in other cases, maybe a bit behind. This was inspired for me while I was having a conversation not too long ago with the CISO of a company very well known for like high quality security. And I started talking about the concept of prioritizing internet reachable vulnerabilities. And she said basically like, yeah, that's an incident. That's not like a thing that we fix in 30 days. That's an incident. We need to fix that right now. And that just, made me realize we have to hear that more and hear these different perspectives from more people so that we can adjust away from this old concept. So that's why we're here today. And I'm really excited to kick this off. The way that we're going to do this is we have a series of questions for the first 50 minutes that we're going to ask by the FedRAMP team. The first question we're going to ask of all of our participants today. So you get to hear a lot of different perspectives on the same thing. We're going to ask all of our participants to raise hands so that we have an order to go through and ask these questions of folks. Then in the follow-on questions, we will open it up to 3 or 4 of the participants to answer based on the ones that they think are most interesting. Okay, so finally, the intent of this conversation is not to create a platform for feedback to FedRAMP. We just want to have an open conversation about how folks do things. We're not looking to necessarily say, this is what we think of the RFC, et cetera. That's what the public comment period is for. This is just to kind of give us more insight into what's going on and how it will affect people and how businesses will approach it. With that said, let's go ahead and have everyone raise their hands and we will start doing the first question. All right, So the first question is, could you please broadly describe your company's approach to vulnerability management and any key differences in this approach that exist between government and commercial environments, if applicable? Johann, let's start with you.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so I mean, with us, we've definitely had to take the automation approach, right? I mean, it quickly became just unmanageable to do anything sort of at the human level, creating POAMs, creating deviation requests and things like that, with just the volume of scan results. We're running at least weekly scans, and we need to automate the parsing process of that. So our automation essentially, ingests any scans that we run through our tooling, automatically creates tickets based on the scopes within our ticketing system, and then allows for human involvement in that aspect to kind of review it, look at it, and based on this new process, that would where we would make our risk adjustments, our mitigation decisions, and things like that. And we've also tied in some automation around looking at our inventory versus what has been scanned to ensure that we're covering everything. I think that's a very key aspect as well. But yeah, essentially just automation to aid human decisions has been the main course that we've taken.
Automation to aid human decisions is what it's all about, thinking about technical context. That's awesome. Rob, how about you?
Yeah, so very similar approach. We have an incredible ProdSec team that keeps an ear to the ground, so to speak, of vulnerabilities coming out. So we don't necessarily always wait for vuln scans to assess vulnerabilities. When things are coming out, especially things like Log4j and Spectre, Meltdown, all these things, where we treat them similar to incidents, all hands on deck, approaching those vulnerabilities. The interesting thing, though, is that since Okta has been doing federal, a lot of the federal requirements has raised the bar across even the commercial space. And so what I mean by that is, the approach to deviations, the approach to patching, the SLAs and all of that, we have aligned to the FedRAMP requirements. But that has created obvious challenges which require automation. And so one of the things is, yes, automation solves a lot of things, but also reducing threat surface. So one of the big things that I've focused on, because we have to adhere so closely to FedRAMP and DoD and state ramp requirements with regard to how we prioritize and address POAM items, is threat surface reduction. So as an example, one of the things that we started rolling out was distroless containers, shifting to products like ChainGuard, which reducing something like 80+% of vulnerabilities in the containers. So if the junk isn't there, it's not going to be a ticket, it's not going to be a deviation, and it's not going to be a POAM. So that is my approach to reducing the amount of effort involved with vuln management. And that's a huge rock if you can just reduce 80% of your vulns out of the gate. So I'll leave it there. Back to you, Pete.
Yeah, if you re-architect your environment to reduce that, then you have less of a burden on the back end later. I love that. As we go to the next couple of folks, I forgot to mention, if you want to mention your company, background, title, anything like that, feel free to do so. Dave, over to you.
Yeah, hi, Dave Kell. I'm with Google Cloud, and I'm our tech lead for vulnerability management with a focus on GCP. That's really where I'm going to focus. My perspective is product delivery for GCP. So we deal with millions of assets, globally. So we really have to focus hard on automation for scanning, for triaging, for bug filing, observing remediations, and reporting. And our scanning approach, it's across the SDLC and it's across pipelines. So it happens at code, it happens at build, certainly happens at runtime. It covers first-party code, it covers third-party code. And also we, provide third-party products as first-party. So we've got some scanning that's got to take place there. And then it's in the native GCP itself, such as at the organization folder and project level, and being able to provide visibility across that, whether that's internal or whether that's externally facing. So it's a pretty large program that is centrally managed by an Alphabet team that we then take advantage of as part of that scaling. We do, on top of that, we've got our vulnerability rewards program that gives us access to external security researchers and gives us an outside view. So we don't have the group think when we think about risk and we think about exposures. We're able to leverage external security researchers for that. We even host invited bug squats. So we pick a product, the invited security researchers come in to like Sunnyvale, California, and they spend a couple days just pounding on the products and help us identify attack paths or attack surfaces we may not have thought of. So again, a really great external view there. We've also invested heavily in AI, particular LLMs, to help us with the triage and the scaling. We also use a vulnerability command center that's looking for emerging risks and threats. And we do treat our critical vulnerabilities when we define them as a security incident. And it is through our vulnerability command center that we start to enable rapid response to drive down and mitigate those particular high level vulnerabilities. We also invest heavily in cloud vulnerability research and red teaming, so that we're not just using our automation and using our machine-based discovery, but we're using human discovery to help find some of those tangential attack paths. That's it for me.
Awesome. I know I saw Nicole's face light up when you mentioned the vulnerability bounties, because that's something we've been figuring out. Like, how can FedRAMP incentivize that? Like, not necessarily a requirement, but how can we incentivize that? Because we see a lot of evidence that provides strong value. Brandon.
All right, thanks, Pete. So Brandon Ganem from GitHub. I lead the vulnerability management program here. So one of the things we've really focused in on is developer experience with our vulnerability program. So this means we scan as often as possible at build time. We tell you if the things you're doing at build time are going to fix the things we find in production for you. We do that state reconciliation in CI to say, yeah, if you get it out to all of these environments, you fix the vulnerabilities. As a developer, we've got fast feedback cycles for that. We've tried to really emphasize fast scanning everywhere. So if you've got like an infrastructure host that you're trying to patch things, we've got a way to rescan that and get you an answer that you fix this thing right away. The other thing we do, focusing on that developer experience, is we tell people about these things where they work. So our program is built around notifying teams in GitHub issues, getting them into the project boards that they're using to manage their regular work. So again, it just feels like normal work that engineers are picking up and then go fix these things. And then the last thing that we've done that I think is a big difference maker is we've built a really robust exceptions program. And that lets us as a business choose what risks we want to take on. If there's a vulnerability that's really difficult to fix, but doesn't actually cause a lot of production risk, we can then bring that to our business leaders, get approvals there, and bring that to our security leaders and make sure that, yes, this aligns with the risk management approach we have at GitHub. And then again, that all integrates back to the CI scanning, the notifications we send out, and just that deep integration for the developer experience.
I can't emphasize enough how much I love the normal work that engineers are just picking up. Like it's how vulnerability. You shouldn't have a separate compliance organization that's out here on the side running scans and doing stuff. Like, so make it part of the work. I love that. Tyler, how about from your side?
Awesome. Hey everyone, I'm Tyler. I lead our vulnerability environmental threat assessment organization at Salesforce, and basically along the same lines that everyone before me has kind of mentioned around automation, automated ticketing, dashboarding, kind of meeting developers where they are, scanning all along the SDLC. I think one thing just to highlight there is we kind of look at it from an approach of, if we're doing some type of scanning in runtime, we want to have comparative scanning earlier in the SDLC. So whether it's in CI, CD, or even vice versa, if we're going to be having a block in CI, we likely should have the same kind of detection in runtime, so we can see if there's drift, is there escapes from that kind of CI guardrails program. So that's one thing we really emphasize, but one thing I was very excited about with this RFC, because we already kind of do this in our commercial environments, is taking a more risk-based approach to vulnerability management. And the way I really like to try to break it up is we have exposure management and then we have vulnerability management. So exposure management is really those vulnerabilities that are exploitable, have known exploitation, they're on business critical assets. And then vulnerability management is just really patch management at the end of the day. So are you updating your base images? Do you have auto fix PRs? And really we track it from almost a hygiene perspective. Engineering teams, they should be re-rolling their fleets every 30 days at a bare minimum. And that should, in theory, fix all your vulnerabilities if you're updating packages and things kind of at a high level. So we really like to try to break those two things apart. So we treat exposures more like incidents because those are critical. We need to go fix those now. Everything else can kind of just go into the daily routine that engineering teams follow with all those processes.
Yeah, that's also super interesting to hear, and how we tried to approach that with the idea of like credibly exploitable vulnerabilities as like an exposure as you define it. So I'm really fascinated to see how our proposed approach will align with yours and where you want to change things and things like that. Like this is super, super fun stuff. Hazem, how about you?
Hey man, how's it going, Pete? Hello, everybody. Hazem Dettweiler. I'm the Director of U.S. Public Sector Compliance for Cisco, about 2 months removed from a 5.5 year career at AWS, and prior to that, about 10 years in federal service. I'm feeling everybody on this particular topic. There's a lot of heavyweight champion class security professionals in this forum, and I could probably do a little poll, show of hands, who like whether you're in private and public sector, who's cracked this nut. It's challenging, and that's why it's vulnerability or risk management, vulnerability management, and not vulnerability elimination. This is like a constant battle and struggle that we're going to have, and we just have to iterate and optimize. But here we are as an entire community solving for this together. So kudos to Pete and FedRAMP. I think that's what FedRAMP is doing with the 20X initiative. It's bringing topics around applied security to the forefront so we can all solve it as an industry. We all want the same outcomes. So I'm glad we're here discussing it. I'll just start by saying at Cisco, we don't really kind of view vulnerability management as purely a con-mon activity. That, inherent in that definition is something you do post-deployment. I think you heard a lot of the panelists state it's something you want to do right in your DevSecOps process. So none of this like wait till your assets are in production, run a scan, detect on these production-ready state assets, and then only to find north of 800 vulnerabilities from components and containers that have been end of life for years with tons of technical debt. And now let's start vulnerability management, right? Over the years, refinements in this approach traditionally focus on automation of those post-deployment activities, focusing on prioritization, just because of the sheer necessity to be able to keep up with the volume of exponential growth and volume of like vulnerabilities themselves. But at Cisco, it's vulnerability really management starts at secure service deployment. We all know poor service design opens the way to vulnerabilities. So, a lot of the panelists were talking about reducing the attack surface itself by designing with security in mind. But what does that actually mean? It means using threat modeling to validate the design security. It means applying product security baseline design principles right up front. It means being aware of like common attack methods and designing safeguards against them. So that's what we're doing. Traditionally, post-deployment, we're doing a lot of process automation and orchestration and grouping vulnerabilities by shared dependencies.
I think it's kind of fascinating how threat modeling is something a lot of folks talk about, but I'm always sort of fascinated, like how would I write a standard that forces threat, and like what's the threat modeling checklist? There isn't a checklist for threat modeling. It is complex. It depends on your environment, etc.
Great use case for AI, right?
Yeah. So before we jump to Matt, I just want to point out for the audience, like I think people can raise their hands here, but our intent is to only have this conversation with panelists that were already approved for this. So if you have a question you want to ask, you can put it in the Q&A, and we'll get to that closer to the top of the hour. Otherwise, we'd ask you not to use the raise hands feature unless you're one of our panelists. Thank you. Matt, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Pete. So this far in the list, I don't think we're going to have too many surprises over the other teams. But so real quick, Matt Topper, president of UberEther. We sit in an interesting spot on this panel because we're both a CSP that offers a secure ICAM framework to the federal government as a private tenant, but we're also an ATO accelerator. So we see a lot of SaaS companies and other vendors trying to get FedRAMP and give them kind of a hyper secure best practice architecture to bring their solutions in, covering about 80% of the controls. And I think, as many of the others have said, what we have all, right, the vulnerabilities management across all of your components is great, but where we focus on with our customers and kind of tag their resources is where is the ingress and the egress points for everything in the environment. And it's not just your front end web servers, it's also how do your admins come in? How are they bringing in their artifacts to put on top of the containers? And if there's vulnerabilities that pop up or on those edge services, we prioritize them for the customers to look at and mitigate, and in some cases actually start taking action ourselves because we've got access to kind of that control plane. So I'm loving seeing the new RFC coming out and really focusing on that side because, right, we all know, yes, an actor can get in and move laterally, and if the things aren't patched behind the scenes, but they got to get in the front door somehow. So I'll make it easy and leave it with that.
It's right, like you got to be able to reach it. You got to be able to reach it to exploit it. Absolutely. Patrick?
Hey everybody, Patrick Woods. I'm a senior manager for security compliance here at AWS. Look, like AWS's approach to vulnerability management is largely working backwards from the risk that vulnerabilities pose to our customers and our services. Like other panelists, when we find a risk that's emergent, that requires an emergent action, we work those at an accelerated pace with an around-the-clock effort by engineering teams across the company. For those other vulnerabilities where we identify risk, I think some of the other panelists have indicated this. We meet the developer where they are. We implement those remediation efforts through our software development lifecycle, and a big part of why we obsess over how we think about risk and how we evaluate risk associated with these vulnerabilities is like a one-size-fits-all approach just simply doesn't work. It doesn't scale. Different products require different types of responses. And so concepts like production, non-production, internet-facing, how the authentication works, they all play a role and are inputs to our evaluation of risk, but our security engineers across the company are taking into consideration a whole lot of variables when we're determining the right way to respond to a risk. More long-term, like others on the panel have indicated, we're investing heavily in automation. We make heavy use of first-party tooling that we've developed in-house to help us identify vulnerabilities. That allows us to tightly integrate with our internal systems and our internal builder tools. And that again allows us to detect and respond quicker because we can identify vulnerabilities at the earliest possible stage in the development lifecycle. So yeah, I don't think there's much more that I can add to that, but I'm happy to be a participant today.
Thanks so much. I mean, one size fits all is kind of hilarious because to some degree that's one of FedRAMP's problems. Is that people often ask us, like, can you just give us the one size and then we'll make everything fit it? And I have to be like, no, one size does not fit all. We need to have some technical expertise involved in this. John, your perspective.
Hi, John Elliott. I'm on the product security team here at Wiz and leading the vulnerability management efforts in commercial and FedRAMP environments. So our approach is, try to have a proactive shift left aggressively philosophy because we want to prevent vulnerabilities from reaching production in the first place wherever possible. So like others have said, we have various automations and checks, security controls at different stages of the SDLC. We're scanning code repositories and commits for vulnerabilities. We're building code into services. It's running on minimal base container images, like we're using WizOS, that reduces the vulnerability surface area. Then those images, things are layered onto them, but they get scanned again for vulnerabilities before they're uploaded to image registries. And we're a big Kubernetes shop, so at deploy time, we have admission controllers in our Kubernetes clusters that are again checking, hey, is this image cryptographically signed, and does it have metadata tagged on it that indicates it passed all these vulnerability policies throughout all those CI/CD phases. Then once they're actually running, we have like continuous workload vulnerability scanning running against the clusters themselves. We're a security vendor. We use our own product, Wiz, to do this, called Wiz for Wiz. And we take all of our vulnerability data and all this telemetry and put it in a thing called our security graph. It kind of shows us the relationship between the resources and where the vulnerabilities exist, and allows us to kind of trace where in that like code to cloud pipeline vulnerabilities were introduced. And so these are context-based issues that we're able to surface and assign an SLA based on severity. And we're interested in the highest risk attack path relative, where the vulnerability exists in the environment. So does it exist on an endpoint that has internet exposure? Is it on a workload that requires like a service account with high privileges? Does it have a network path to a database that has like sensitive information? And that's sort of the things that we want to prioritize. Say the technology we deploy on commercial and FedRAMP are generally identical, but the operating model in the FedRAMP environment is a little bit different when it comes to vulnerability management. Obviously, we still have those context-based issues, available to us in FedRAMP, and we treat those with the highest priority. But we still have to spend like an inordinate amount of like resources on the non-contextual vulnerabilities so that we can remediate them in the mandated time frame. So a low severity CVE can become a high priority issue if it's approaching the deadline for being fixed, right? And in other cases, we have to treat CVEs with a CVSS score of like 7.5 on an isolated backend system with like all kinds of controls around it, the same priority as a CVE on a public facing endpoint, but like our internal context-based models don't prioritize those equally the way they present them to us. So that's sort of, I guess, the difference is that, engineering resources being allocated in a different way in FedRAMP to address, things in our POAM that we feel could have been spent on kind of preventing those issues from occurring in the first place by adding more mitigations and root causing. How do things get into the pipeline in the first place? Or in some cases, you can't control it. I mean, CVEs get published, things are already running, but that's sort of the difference. But, we like the RFC, we like the language, credibly exploited vulnerability, prioritizing things based on potential adverse impact. It's more aligned with kind of the context-aware security we use in our like commercial environment. So,
Wiz for Wiz is cool. I think that's always a good sign when a cybersecurity company is using their own product and improving it like that. Also, there was a thing you said in there that I think was really interesting that I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about. But it's a good takeaway for all of us to consider, like finding where the vulnerabilities are introduced. Like that is it. Like normally we're focused on there's a vulnerability, fix it, and we don't really think about kind of, I don't know, the internal engineering supply chain, as it were, that results in that vulnerability getting introduced. But if we can find where those things are happening and cut them off before they get introduced, obviously, then we have a lot less of a problem. That's really cool. Alex.
Thanks, Pete. Hey, everybody. Alex Nieves. I run our global certifications federal team here at Palo Alto Networks. So I think everybody's pretty familiar by now with differences in commercial and FedRAMP, right? Like one has more requirements than the other one, generally. So what we try to do is shift left as much as possible, as most of our panelists have stated, because when you do that, you drastically reduce the amount of vulnerabilities that are ever going to be present to begin with, and then you spend less cycles in fire drills, 24/7 war rooms, trying to fix things that shouldn't have been there to begin with. So what we try to do now is really apply the FedRAMP mentality from a conmon and hygiene perspective to commercial builds, because we like to use a lot of the same images and then tweak them for federal environments. If you do that, you can basically get to the root problem before it ever gets to any of your environments. Even if commercial doesn't have the same parameters or requirements that a federal environment does, you should still be fixing all that stuff, even if no one's telling you to. So the way that we do a lot of that is we pool all of our different scanning repos and scanner information into basically a dashboard that's accessible for all of our different product teams, which there's dozens of them. It's impossible for them to keep up on it. It's impossible for just a single InfoSec group to keep up on it. So we make it easy for everybody. We run a lot of it, but we say, hey, 36 different teams, like here's the dashboard, here's your assets, here's your vulnerabilities. We run our risk adjustments through that. We run our deviation rationale through that, lowering of CVSS scores, you name it. We have a dashboard for it. And that helps drastically reduce the way that they respond to it. And instead of them asking, hey, can I see a scan of my whatever asset I want to see, you can just log in directly and look at it. And then that helps triage. That helps a lot of our processes of working directly with the teams. Like we do a lot of handholding, don't get me wrong. We work with these teams to say, hey, here's your vulnerabilities. We have categorization and prioritization metrics in place of here's upcoming, what will be overdue if you don't fix it by X date. Like we want to know your patching cycle. We want to know when your next release is, what you can and can't fix, and give us milestones for why you can't do a thing. Because I'm not an expert in all Palo Alto products. I never will be. There's too many of them, and they're all different. So going back to the one-size-fits-all approach, it's nice on paper. I wish it were true in reality. It would make my life easier. But the reality is we have to actually work with feasible metrics and an understanding of what is this team actually able to do and by when, and then drive down vulnerabilities from there. But honestly, it all goes back to shifting left. I mean, the more you fix ahead of time, the easier things are. We've actually had teams sometimes say, oh, well, if I scan before, do I have to scan in production? Like, yeah, you still do, because unless you can show me a clean scan, like it's still going to be there. So that's what we try to apply across the board, from commercial all the way up to DoD environments. We kind of apply the same thing. And that kind of helps us bridge the gap between whether or not there's a requirement, like doing security and compliance should just be by nature. So that's what we really try to strive towards.
It's so, when you're talking about the centralized dashboard concept there within Palo, it's one of the things that M2415 has kind of set out as a vision for FedRAMP, is to enable CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, to have access to a bunch of continuous monitoring data as part of their CDM program, to be in a world where we as a federal government can have that picture into our own stuff. And it's like weird, trying to have that across the whole federal government. It's crazy because the federal government's massive, 18 different enterprises, 18,000 different enterprises. But I think it's cool to hear this. And I think the trend lines I'm hearing already, which kind of have me pretty inspired, right, is shifting things left so that you're introducing less vulnerabilities to start with, have a better architecture so that if vulnerabilities are introduced, they're less likely to have a problem, and then actually enable and empower your engineering teams to investigate, prioritize, fix as part of their process, which to me, that's what certainly what I think is the value that a commercial cloud service with engineering tech companies bring to the government. All right, so we're going to go into some smaller questions here. The first question I'm going to ask, if a few of you are interested in answering, raise your hands when you're up to here. Just like, okay, what are the major pain points that you have experienced with FedRAMP requirements? And are there any that have actually negatively affected your security posture in actual practice? Dave.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question and an interesting one to answer from Google's perspective. At Google, our expectations of security and vulnerability management are actually much higher and stricter than the FedRAMP requirements. And so we have to try to balance, our obligation certainly to our customers and to these regulatory frameworks, while also maintaining a very high standard internally. And the problem that we run into is we can meet the FedRAMP SLA, and product teams get encouraged to do that, and it turns sort of into a whack-a-mole approach, as opposed to what we want to take is a much more measured approach around systemic remediation. We want to engineer away whole classes of vulnerabilities. We still need to have vulnerability management. We still need an SLO and an SLA at runtime, because that's our trailing indicator. And that gives us an observation or a signal of engineering teams that may be struggling with secure by default, secure by design practices. But it's more important for us to spend the majority of our time to that shift left and building out these well-lit paths, building out easy ways to accept sort of coding frameworks, to set up, easily address some of the secure by default so that they don't have misconfigurations within the product infrastructure. But that's a balancing act that we have to take. So we actually have a higher bar for security. We consider our bar the high bar, where we consider something like FedRAMP. Frankly, it's a low bar because it's compliance focused and it's not getting us to the secure outcomes where we need to get to. So it's a balancing act for us. I think moving to a contextual risk-based approach for vulnerability management starts to better align our internal expectations with those external obligations.
Yes. Thank you. Hazem.
I mean, I've been waiting years to answer this question. So no more of this 10 unique vulnerabilities resulting in a deficiency trigger. And then what, you got 1,000 endpoints? Yeah, 10 unique vulnerabilities you're getting escalated on. You got 10 million endpoints? Yes, 10 unique vulnerabilities you're getting escalated on. Constant rebaselining with justification that has to go through a bureaucratic like approval process. We had bona fide security engineers out here writing narratives like technical writers instead of heads down risk-based mitigation and remediation like based on exploitability. So like I'm really glad that mentality is behind us, and instead we're having substantive discussion on how to achieve better applied security outcomes. I'm glad that we're no longer going to, it was painful because you had to justify why, like I have a 2-tier architecture and this server is basically locked down. There's a single port that can get to it from a single approved server. And the kernel is stripped down, but yet it's signaling a certain signature. And you had to go through so much effort to basically state that the risk is minimal in that situation. Yet maybe a moderate vulnerability to the point of this RFC that's internet facing and proven exploitable is sitting there being ignored because we're catering to anything with a CVSS of high. That was painful, and doing that at scale was always painful. So I'm glad those were the major pain points, and I'm glad those days are behind us and we're focusing on what matters.
I totally feel you on that. I think this one is obviously interesting that a lot of folks want to answer it, so we'll try to get everyone, but let's go quick. Alex?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think we could spend the entire time talking about this if we wanted to, right? I would just say that the general mentality that we've kind of always seen over the last decade, whether on the audit side of things or the CSP side, that a high is a high, a low is a low, like treating vulnerabilities on paper, just like this is a high, you have 30 days to fix it. I don't care what you say. Like, no, you're not risk adjusting that. I don't believe you. Spending cycles and cycles of frankly wasting time explaining to someone who doesn't understand our system why this is not a threat. So I love the approach of we need to get away from that and get more towards like context, because context matters. If you're 7 layers deep in my system and you're a super user admin at that point, like, yeah, you're right, it's exploited, you got me. Hopefully you're not. So you're really just getting away from that. That causes a lot of stress, especially when you have teams that are, small teams working multiple priorities across the board at a large company. What do you balance, right? Like, do I need to fix this thing that's not really a problem and spend cycles of, in between releases trying to fix a thing deep down in the image that really isn't a problem? Or can I focus on a feature or further development or other things that are frankly more important than fixing something that's not actually a problem? And then you have agencies that I saw somebody questioning, or someone put a question in the chat earlier of like, do different agencies have different requirements that they mentioned? Yeah, all the time. They decide that they're the most important one that's doing business with you, and they will come up with whatever they want. I've even had agencies come to me with a POAM sheet that they made up themselves off of our deliverables, and then asked us why they weren't closed. So I mean, there's some things that really drag down actually doing our work that we're supposed to be doing. So yeah, FedRAMP can cause some problems with those requirements at times when honestly a lot of it is people misinterpret fixing all the things because it says the SLA is 30 days, and then they don't want to hear it when you have a justification as to why it's not as important as they might think it is. So
yeah, I mean, yeah. So I think the next question that we have kind of is the same question really in a different way. So let's keep your hands up and we'll hit you in this order. And I'll hand it over to Nicole and kind of like you can combine the last question and this one in your answers.
Yeah, sure. So can FedRAMP requirements ensure that security teams actually get the tools and capabilities that they need to do good security? Tyler, do you want to take this one first?
Yeah, so kind of going along the lines of the last question into this question, my least favorite thing is CVSS-based scores. I have 9.8 like seared into my head, and it is my least favorite number ever. As everyone kind of knows, base score, it's kind of like theoretical, what's the worst case scenario risk? And yet we're stuck here with a bunch of 9.8s because that's how the CVSS scoring works. And we're sending these all to engineering teams. I know we talked about automation, remediation, that kind of thing. There's still effort that engineering teams have to put into their release cycles to fix these vulnerabilities. The problem is that 9.8 actually that needle in a haystack of like, this is actually exploitable in the context of that service? We might not never know because they're looking at the rest of everything else and they might just go and deviate that one because they don't have the necessarily security vulnerability context. They just know my service. So they don't know it's being exploited. They don't have that threat intelligence information. So we kind of run into that issue. We might push away that important one in favor of ones that seem important, but in reality, they aren't. So if we could get away from CVSS base scoring as the criteria, which I know this RFC is trying to do, like I would be so happy.
Yeah, thanks for that. Johann, do you want to keep going on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to reiterate a lot of what was already said. I mean, I can't agree more. You know, having a CVSS score sort of being the one thing that dictates the risk within my system without taking into context the architecture and everything that's built there. You know, it's really the shift in this ecosystem of moving from compliance to security based, I think is going to be huge. And so yeah, I mean, to answer the third question, absolutely, I think FedRAMP can help to enforce good security. But you know, as you know, the gentleman from Google explained earlier, and I feel similar is that you know, oftentimes we're implementing stricter security. You know, for us in our commercial customers, the threat to them is very real. It's financial. It's not just regulatory, right? So we're implementing above and beyond. I think FedRAMP kind of taking this shift to say, hey, generally, this is a good idea to do. You should really look at this, and we're going to give you the broad kind of outline of what you should be doing, but take it further. Do it in your own way. Do it in a way that makes sense for your architecture. That's such a thrilling attitude to take. And then the only thing I'll say is, you know, at some point we're probably all going to have to sit down, you know, the 3POs involved in the ecosystem, the PMO involved in the ecosystem, and the CSPs, and say, you know, you're allowed to make risk-based decisions based on the context of your system. And this is kind of how we're going to do that. And, you know, the PMO can help kind of step in and adjudicate cases where the 3PO says, you know, we're a little not sure about how they made this risk adjustment. And, you know, giving us the opportunity as the CSP to say, no, trust us. Like, this is our analysis. This is our very thorough analysis based on our context. This is why we're saying the risk is this. I'm very excited to move towards that way of doing business in this ecosystem.
I'm so glad you called that out because a huge part of our thinking in this has been how do we empower security professionals to actually be security professionals and think through what the risk is to their own service offering in their own context. So really glad that you guys are picking up on that. We're getting a ton of feedback about like, hey, can you define exactly what you mean by this term? Or how do I determine if something is internet reachable or not? And like, you're a security professional. You tell us, like, in your context, what does that mean for you? Patrick, do you want to keep going?
Yeah, I'll answer the most recent question first, real quick, and then I want to tag on to the prior question. But I'm sure in some instances, FedRAMP requirements can drive security investments. At AWS, though, like security is our top priority. That goes from the CEO all the way down to like the newest employee, newest engineer. everybody understands that that is the number one job, the number one priority across the entire company. And so I'll echo some of the other comments that were made earlier. Like we work backwards from our customers' expectation that we're delivering and building the most secure and resilient products in the world, and that's what we work backwards from every day. So that's the most important thing for us at AWS. I want to tack on to the prior question about pain at FedRAMP, and unsurprisingly, Hazem stole a little bit of my thunder, which is okay. But I want to double click on the we need to have better mechanisms and better ways to communicate the decisions that we're making, the risk-based decisions we're making. Obviously, we obsess over security, we obsess over the resilience of our services and the availability of our services, and that comes into play when we're considering how, when, where we take action in response to these vulnerabilities. And those decisions, increasingly, as we adopt automation, are going to occur at machine speed. We're going to be detecting vulnerabilities at machine speed. We're going to be responding at machine speed. And if we're taking engineers and as Hazem said, turning them into tech writers by asking them to move from machine speed to documentation speed to write out the justification behind the risk and communicate that, we're going to see diminishing returns on our investments in automation. So can't stress enough that we need a better, more effective way of communicating those.
That's a great point. Yeah, lots to think about, especially as we're piloting a lot of the FedRAMP 20X concepts and looking at how do CSPs tell us about their environment that's not hundreds of pages of a narrative document. John.
Yeah, so for the question on getting tools and capabilities they need to get security, to do good security, I'd say, I think most of these tools probably already exist. They're probably already available. And it's just maybe transparency around like what the FedRAMP wants the outcome to be from those tools. And there's, maybe if there becomes a FedRAMP requirement in the future that, let's say, required a tool that wasn't available to, on the FedRAMP marketplace or available to be used in FedRAMP, maybe some guidance around how we can get those tools into our environment if we needed to, or if customer needed to do that. The other thing I would say on the previous questions in terms of, is there anything negatively affected our security posture? I would say that like generally, like if you're an organization and you had an immature sort of security program to begin with, and you went through the FedRAMP process, you would probably be more secure as a result of that, because you have to look at vulnerability management, you'd have to develop incident response and diagram your systems and things like that. Maybe you'd never done that before. But I would say that the only negative thing would, just the time being spent on, the vulnerability management in its current form. And another thing is like going through SCRs, for example, if you're doing multiple SCRs a year, that also has a big vulnerability management component to it as well. So it's kind of just maybe a resource allocation thing that causes other things to be backlogged or deprioritized that might have a high security risk in your register or something that should be focused on.
Yeah, that's a great point. Rob?
Yeah, just wanted to add more to kind of what everybody was saying about how a lot of the automation tooling is already there, as a leader in the industry, where we automate all the way down to the developer pipelines, of course, with regard to vuln management, scanning, and remediation before it gets into the environment. But, some of the FedRAMP regulation is really kind of getting in the way of that, right? So we get into a situation, and I'm sure everybody else deals with this too, where you have a priority of a CVSS finding, and you really want to address that real finding, that one that's like an exposed risk on the edge that may not be a 9.8, but we got to prioritize this arbitrary CVSS finding. And the thing about the CVSS findings is that they're just the raw scores. Anybody who does evaluation would actually take that vulnerability and run it through with mitigations to redefine what that new score would be in the CVSS calculator, adding our own, with the mitigations in there. So that's how in my view, we should be ranking and doing deviations on these rather than just a single deviation reduction, which there was this standard for, that gets in the way of us actually focusing on ones that are credibly exploitable, which is deeply frustrating. SCRs too, the whole SCR process, we have to spend all this effort building out and auditing these systems where all of the pipelines to deliver software have already been audited and assessed. So if you can validate that those systems are meeting the expectations of FedRAMP, you should be relatively assured that whatever your new products or services that you're running through those pipelines are also meeting those expectations, which I could probably say almost everybody here is running through the same type of security SDLC, CI/CD pipeline for delivery. M&As being an exception to that, where you kind of have to fold them in first. It gets a little awkward. But yeah, FedRAMP is driving a lot of adoption of tooling, but not always in a good way. It's in the opposite way, right? Another big example, and I'll stop after this, is RFC-12 is great. I'm excited for that. A lot of it is what we already do. We approach it, that, if there's a credible vulnerability, we approach those first, right? But the problem is, in a boundary that is authorized by multiple regulatory bodies. So as an example, we do DoD, we do FedRAMP, civilian, we do state ramp. I don't want 3 different regulatory bodies to be doing this, or 3 different POAM approaches, or 3 different deviation approaches. There needs to be alignment in government and how we do that. And frankly, if FedRAMP's going forward with 12, it's like, well, unless DISA does that, I can't move forward with that. FedRAMP and DoD's, in ours is the same boundary, same authorization boundary. We have all kinds of reciprocity and inherited controls and things from the FedRAMP environment. Becomes a mess. So what I'd like to see is consistency there, so that we can have consistent automation and don't need to pay for more automation to deal with more regulation as a result of the disagreement across agencies.
Definitely one of the goals that's near and dear to all of our hearts here is to try to get all of government on board with a unified process. We're quickly running out of time, but Matt, I want to make sure you can get your answer in first before we...
Yeah, appreciate it, Nicole. So listening to everyone kind of before me on this question, it's interesting because if we look across this panel, we've got a bunch of hyper secure CSPs, right? And when you look at folks outside of kind of this realm that, right, security is kind of all of our company's jobs first, we go, oh yeah, this is normal. This is the way we do things. But when we've brought on a bunch of the vendors to our A2 Accelerator platform, FedRAMP is almost in the past tool agnostic to a fault. And most of the these organizations are trying to say, well, what's the cheapest tool I could buy to just check this box? And this is forcing those organizations to grow up. And it's funny, we've seen, and I think Okta, right, Rob, you said this before, you brought in processes for scanning, for vulnerability management, for exploits management. And then magically it's like, oh, this is actually good. We need to shift this left to our commercial products. And we've actually seen a lot of that starting to happen because of FedRAMP, where we've got our environment. I jokingly call it we give you the box of all the government best practices with all the tools the government likes to see versus the new startup that they haven't seen 50 times before. But as long as you follow this, kind of 80%, and all you have to worry about is deploying your app. Well, invariably, they get to their ATO and 6 months later, they're like, hey, could you do this for our commercial products too? And then magically, their commercial products are now more secure. And then their FedRAMP processes are all easier because, they're mitigating this before it even gets to the FedRAMP environment in most cases. So there has been some help. And then you get the security folks internally, oh my God, we've been begging to get these set of tools for this long. So there is some good. So thank you.
I mean, a lot of times it comes back to M2415. I mean, that's the way it works in government. M2415 told us what to do. It tells agencies what to do. It tells us to do this in this way. And one of the critical, key, explicit strategies and responsibilities for FedRAMP outlined in M2415 is to leverage shared infrastructure between the federal government and the private sector to encourage the agency and federal government adoption of commercial services and to not incentivize the creation of separate services for the government. And a big reason in that is the very explicit advantage that commercial cloud service providers can be incentivized to integrate that improved security into their commercial environments as a result of engaging with FedRAMP to benefit all customers. That is something that I think when that memo was written, probably a lot of us laughed at the idea of FedRAMP as incentivizing security into commercial systems, but that's really where we want to go. So we had a bunch of other questions here, but this conversation has been awesome, and I think we've actually nailed a lot of these questions. I am going to do you know what, we'll even skip the lightning round. Let's just go straight to audience Q&A. I've got some questions queued up here, and this is gonna be the same kind of thing. Maybe 3 or 4 people raise hands and chime in if you want. I'm gonna start with the first one, which is, how does your company use KEVs, known exploited vulnerabilities, and EPSS, exploit prediction scoring system, I think, in your vulnerability management processes? Does anyone play with KEVs and EPSS and want to talk about that a bit? Alex.
We yell at anybody that has a kev in any of their images because you're not allowed to, and it's bad. And then we throw the CISA date in their face and say this should have been fixed years ago. Why the hell does your image still have this in it? And we say, hey, this is now your priority. This is your job. You go fix this thing and don't do it again. So I'm making light of this, but that's literally what we do. We say, why is this here? Don't ever do that again.
Works for me. Tyler, how about you?
I think Alex hit the point really well. Like, it becomes a very good enforcing function to use CISA-KEV, but we even go further where that's just one vulnerability intelligence source that we have. Same with EPSS. We have lots of threat intelligence vendors that also have additional vulnerabilities, not on necessarily CISA-KEV. VulnCheck is one that I know people talk about a lot, where they have their own VulnCheck KEV list, where we try to pull in as much exploit information as possible and use that for our prioritization.
Amazing. John?
I haven't seen a CISA KEV in a while, but we do have special controls for detecting those because they have different remediation timeframe if they were to appear in the environment because of the binding operational directives around those. So we prioritize those obviously, and then the other thing I was going to say about EPSS scores, it's like if the score is available, it depends on if the CVE came from MBD, if it's got the complete metadata with it, or if we have to fall back to CNA. But generally, we just go with the vendor severity score in those cases.
And EPSS still requires you to consider context, right? Like, it's just a different approach to CVS there. Another question in a different direction. For FedRAMP scoped vulnerability management, where do AI agents fit across discovery, triage, remediation, and what human-in-the-loop checkpoints ensure auditability? Dave.
Yeah, so the way FedRAMP stands today, an agnostic or an agent AI, can help with scale triage. So what is because of CVS score, what is the disposition of the CVEs in your environment? And if you have a rapid risk approach, you can do that to the agentic AI rather than having a set of security engineers do it. Outside of FedRAMP, though, this is where it gets really interesting because that's how you can really scale across lots of assets, lots of people, and really reduce down your time to triage around context. Is it internet accessible? What's the attack path related to it? Do you have tools that tell you the attack path? Do you have information? Do you have some threat intelligence that you can pull from. And these AI agents are able to reason in the same way as a security engineer and just increase your velocity of being able to get to a conclusion faster and help better prioritize. I think as you know, if RFC 12 and those, you know, becomes that reality, I think the agentic AI, that's certainly a place we should all be looking to help us scale faster, just across the landscape.
Johann.
Yeah, great points there. You know, the one thing I'll say about agentic AI here is know your model. I see a lot of rushing to quickly deploy AI tools into environments, but especially with something around decision, even initial triaging, you really need to understand your model. And I would also argue that you probably need to fine tune it based on your environment, you know, actual model training, not just grabbing something off the internet and plugging it in and seeing what happens, right? So I think that's something to caution. The other thing I would say is that the human in the loop has to always be involved at certain stage gates, right? So you can utilize agentic AI to do that initial triage, but at that point, there needs to be a human that goes back, looks, and agrees with how it may be triaged certain types of vulns within your environment. And then obviously, I would say at the final stage, the decision around mitigation, that can never be left in the hands of AI. That has to have human eyes to say, okay, you know, this is what we did to actually mitigate it. Is the vuln completely removed? Is it mitigated down to a risk level where it's basically non-existent? That human will have to be in the loop there. It can obviously be informed by an AI agent. AI agents are particularly good at reaching out to multiple data sources. So those, you know, various threat sources that were talked about previously, great to bring AI and sort of gather all that in, but it needs to have those human eyes to make that final decision.
Yeah, I mean, it's an old term here. Dating myself, I used to be VP engineering at an AI startup 10 years ago, and like reinforcement learning was a critical aspect of this, right? And kind of in the age of LLMs, we sort of don't think about that to the same degree. But when it comes to things like this, like really reinforcing our agents to make sure that they're doing the right thing and having that human review makes a ton of sense to me. Brandon?
So we're using AI right now for things like auto fixing based on, you know, static analysis or linting rules. And then having that show up as a suggested edit in a PR. And then the engineer is the human in the loop saying, okay, this makes sense, and you save me a bunch of time fixing this. I think that's a pretty good use case already. Where we're still doing a bunch of experimentation is like enriching the triage process for like my analyst team, enriching the things we're sending out to engineers to make it more context aware about the environment, trying to find good use cases for those things. So we're sending more concise summaries or more concise, this is what you must fix, or this is why it's a problem in the environment. A lot of experimentation left to do.
Fantastic. Hazem.
Actually, Pete, you'd be proud of some of the initiatives Sam Adelletti is championing it within Cisco. He's doing some awesome work piloting a FedRAMP policy agent that's doing build time compliance. So we're talking about like treating compliance outcomes as specific unit and function tests baked right into the deployment and monitoring process. So like right there in the pipeline itself on every build and like on every commit. So you get like compliant outcomes that are like right there, part of the development process and reducing the attack surface on the end. I think another good use of AI beyond that is really attack chaining. So while you know something on the surface might not be credibly exploitable, the second you chain it one level deep, it might start to be exploitable. So that's like a good problem to have. Like if you're looking at attack chaining, you're probably a lot more advanced. But I would say that's a good place for the use of AI as well.
I'm actually gonna hop in for a second and take us from looking forward to the future of AI and bring us back to the past a little bit, because we did get a question asking about what do you do with things that are not modern cloud infrastructure when you have legacy VMs and legacy equipment, how do you monitor and protect those, and also protect your modern cloud infrastructure at the same time? Yeah, Brandon.
I mean, the tooling here is not nearly as exciting, right? You're talking about doing vuln scans with authentication against these hosts. But what we've done is, from an engineering standpoint, push people away from using old stateful infrastructure, but then B, we built a ton of automation around, we'll automatically apply patches on these systems because they're up and we can do that. And then we just have a deny list of certain packages that require human in the loop to make sure the patches go okay. And then we've built a bunch of like reboot tooling to make sure the uptime on the fleet is just not very high, because I think it's very bad practice to have hosts that are just alive forever. So we try and have hosts that are not up for very long at all, weeks rather than months and years. So that helps a lot because, well, when you're cycling out hosts often, it's a lot easier to patch a host that is just going to come out of service anyway. We don't have a ton of this infrastructure left, except for the stuff that's running our Kubernetes is like underlying VM infrastructure.
Great. Rob?
Yeah, I'm going to say something extremely controversial here, that VMs are not necessarily old, and there are approaches to building these things, right? So, you can build purpose-built containers. You can also build purpose-built VMs. And we had been doing this for years and years, where you can build VMs and their configurations in CI/CD that they're purpose-built, and treat them the same way as containers. The orchestration is a little more challenging, but there's, if you're using AWS or something like that, you can fold it into, into your launch configurations. If you're using old school on-prem VMware, if that still exists anymore, I'm not sure how that's going, but there's automation around the orchestration of VMs, and you can get pretty close, right? You can run things with probably a little more bubblegum and duct tape, but you can put VMs and things into CI/CD, and the same thing goes for physical hardware devices. Back in my finance days, we used to net boot everything. We treated them as cattle, and they didn't have names, right? And we net booted everything. They were treated as ephemeral, and any data that needed to persist went to persistent things. So regardless of whether you're a container, a VM, or physical infrastructure, it all has to do with your architecture for orchestration, and your SDLC process. And you can modernize both of those regardless of the platform. Not everything needs to be on containers. If you're doing telephony, or you're writing Erlang stuff, or you need dedicated hardware and you're running, I don't know, Bitcoin miners where you need to, have better performance or something, you want direct hardware. So put that orchestration in there, and you can do it for all the, architectures I mentioned.
Matt, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just add, I don't think it's Bitcoin miners anymore, Rob. I think it's all just GPUs on our local machines to generate more cat memes. But right, again, there's a lot of organizations that still run on VMs or still run on physical hardware. And yes, we hope everyone can modernize and run a container that's ephemeral and built on a scratch image that doesn't have legacy. But the reality is, I would say 80% of the world still doesn't even run that way. And what I think we've got a lot of customers that's their life, and that's the only way they can deploy, because this was written 10 plus years ago. A lot of the tools that are advertised as, oh, put it in your CI/CD process, can run on your hosts that live a long time and still drive back into, at the end of the day, a ticketing system to check them off and validate and push. I will say, if that's the world you live in and that's how your software is, we've said, yeah, that might live for a year or two in your production instances, but start getting your developers in the habit that, right, because they are pets, not cattle in these situations. And just say there's not a developer instance in the dev or test environment that lasts more than 30 days, right? And if there is a VM running in VMware or Proxmox or whatever, like just write a job that says blow that shit away every 30 days. And guess what? Your production environments, even though they're still running on VMs, will get stronger because your teams know how to rebuild them. Right? That is your biggest risk is, right, they've lasted there so long that you don't even know how to recreate them. If you start forcing your devs to have a way to do it every 30 days, devs are going to find a way to be more productive because they hate waiting on shit, right? The ice cream cone starts licking itself and solves that problem. And they might find creative ways to get you into more modern architectures, even if it is just Docker running on a physical host that then is running their shit in containers. So, all right, soapbox off. Sorry, y'all.
I'm here especially laughing along with that because, like, sort of like what Rob said, I mean, I built a software-defined data center back in 2008 with net-booted Zen VMs where the operating system was destroyed every time. We never patched anything. It's kind of crazy, like, yeah, old, but also take a modern approach. You don't have to treat it just like it's an operating system from 1985 or something. Like, use your modern tools with your VMs as well. I think so. One of the things that we heard some of you talk about that it's also a big component of RFC-12 is that concept of factoring in potential adverse impact as a really key thing. That's one of the things that just generally I've received a lot of just how are we going to do that? Folks don't understand how to do that. You guys talked about that, so I think you have some ideas on that. So one of these questions here is how are or would you determine that potential adverse impact automatically or with a minimum amount of human intervention, considering it's subjective and can't be defined by a vulnerability tool that you just buy and run? Tyler.
Yeah, one of the things that we do, we're very big on availability. And so anytime someone goes and defines their service for the first time, there's some key metrics or data points that they have to define. So it's kind of the service tier. Is this like if this service goes down, is our application going to go down for customers? Like what would the customer downtime availability impacts be? As well as then like what is the data classification of this service? Like what data does it store? What data is it processing? So on and so forth. And then through kind of our threat modeling process, we kind of start to see those interconnections between this service, this system, and another application. And then we can start to understand of, okay, well, if this service has an adverse impact, an attacker gets root on there, what can they then pivot to from there so that we can start to build out that picture of, okay, there's an adverse impact from a vulnerability on this system. What would that actually mean to our broader environment? And I think, especially in this case, like to our then customers, because I know that's really where like RFC is coming from. Like, is this going to actually have an impact on the federal customers in our environment, or is it just some back-end dev service that nothing will actually happen because it's not really connected to our core application?
Yeah, Brandon, what do you have to add to that?
I mean, Tyler nailed it, but I'd just add having something like a service catalog of some sort that is documenting these like dependency trees, so you can think about it from an availability standpoint, and then documenting, customer data, where does it reside, what is the system processing, are all critical things to include in this like scoring function that in theory we'll have to build for RFC-12.
Johann.
Yeah, our approach is actually something that was kind of lit a fire under us by the 20X program, which is, we're really pushing towards understanding the state of the system on a continuous basis. So essentially associating every control with some sort of automated validation so that at any given time, we can look at the state of that validation and understand what is the actual security ecosystem of the running system in real time. And so we're essentially using that validation layer and that orchestration layer now as our data lake to inform our agentic AIs. So we've established this agentic AI that runs in a Hive architecture where essentially it's utilizing this data lake layer that we're getting from all of our validations to then go and do certain jobs like risk-based decision informing our risk-based decisions, categorizing and classifying the vulnerabilities that are being ingested by our automation, stuff like that. So I think that's a really key aspect is, getting tooling in place to understand the true state of your system and actually utilizing the security controls as a benefit as opposed to just like a massive roadblock that I think they've been for a very, very long time.
Yeah. John.
Oh, did you call on me? Sorry. Yeah, so the potential adverse impact is sort of what we call like a toxic combination. So I think I mentioned earlier about, having a graph of all the data in the environment that can show the relationship between, the code repository, the serverless function, the virtual machine, and the access to data that it all has, taking that all together, and then analyzing that, using that as the primary mechanism to assess whether that vulnerability is incredibly exploitable, because it's showing a viable path from, here's the source of the threat to here's the critical asset that we're trying to protect, right? And I guess, in the commercial or the federal space, the potential adverse impact, could be, data exposure unwanted exposure of data or financial loss, whatever it is. But that's sort of the idea behind, context-aware issues versus, just technical, existence of CV or something in the environment.
Patrick?
Hey, Pete, I just wanted to add, like, there's a cultural element of this as well. And this is why, like, having shared ownership between the security team and the engineering team that are running these applications, running these services day to day is really, really key. Because when you need to make these decisions, when you need to really drill down on potential adverse impacts, or deeply understanding the impact of a vulnerability on a specific service and application, it's not about having that engineer, like, for the first time thinking about security, or for the first time today thinking about security. Like, security needs to be everyone's job, not isolated to the security shop, and involving those people and engineers who deeply understand the products from the very beginning and every moment of every day is a cultural aspect.
I mean, everyone's job is security is absolutely right. And I think that kind of brings me into this last question that I've heard a lot, and I think it's a great point, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as we kind of head towards the end, the last 5 minutes here, which is like, for some companies, it's hard to make sure that there's sufficient technical competence available to be a part of these decisions, especially on the federal side, where the expertise tends to be on the non-federal side. And then the government side is just like, hey, this just runs and it's not supposed to be changed. Like, some people kind of have that attitude. So I'm curious to hear from some of you, like, how do you make sure that you will have the sufficient technical competence available to make these decisions, to do the risk-based review of vulnerabilities, especially when you're a larger company where you might have to have a lot of people doing it. But how do you make sure that you have that competency available? This one is so obvious, nobody wants to chime in. It's just hire good people, make sure you have a good budget, get your leadership on board. Rob?
Yeah, it's I think all of those things. Having leadership on board is a big thing. The last thing a CISO wants is to be in the news, right? And so the company will hire appropriate people for that. But if you can't afford that kind of service or that kind of assessment of vulnerabilities, and you still want to do something highly regulated like FedRAMP, you might want to look at a managed service provider to help you with that, right? And there's a bunch that are out there. A lot of companies just don't have the staff to do things like we're doing, right? I mean, you're talking about the panel on here is absolutely stacked. We're like doing probably the most, in the top 1% of what companies are doing for cybersecurity. But if you're a small company and you can't hire 10 people to look at your 5,000 vulnerabilities and do context-aware prioritization and all of that, use managed services as much as possible. Use managed service providers that provide that. on your behalf, that can build a POAM, can do risk adjustments with you and support you on that without you having a staff, sometimes tens or dozens of people to do it.
Sage advice: rely on people that know what they're doing, bring them in, train them, pay them well, as someone mentioned in the Q&A. Matt?
Yeah, I mean, Rob hit it on the head. It's managed service providers for these companies, right? The same way that 10 years ago, they outsourced hey, we need to set up our laptops, and the intern went back to school for the summer. Somebody needs to make this their full-time job, right? And well, right, my brother's an accountant, right? Like, we're an 8-person accounting shop. I don't know how to set up O365 and harden this. I'm like, there's 5,000 people that do that for a living at a much cheaper rate. There are lots of providers, and we're one of them, that like make FedRAMP easier and help people make the right decisions because they don't have that internally. And it's a model that works and is very successful for organizations wanting to break into the government. And it's in many cases less than a full-time person a year, depending on the level you're going for to hire these services. So, and if you're not going to be able to cover the amount of money for one FTE a year, shouldn't be doing this stuff to begin with.
Yeah, there is kind of a blunt point here, which is in a modern world with the threats that exist right now, if you can't keep up with these requirements, you're going to start to fade because you're not managing your system at the level that's necessary. Hazem, close this out.
So I think bringing in the expertise might be the easy part. The hard part is how to retain that expertise to maintain with the trends in cybersecurity and scale it. And so like I think we all know what's coming here, but like the only ways to do that is, first off, not have a federated model where there's vulnerability management being done 7 different ways across the organization. Centralize into a center of excellence, so when you make an investment in bringing in that expertise, everyone benefits from it with consolidated spend. The other thing is scale it in 2 ways. First, automate that business logic. So those expertise that are bringing in, it's fundamentally a decision tree of things. They just have been doing it for a while and kind of know if this, then that. That can be quantified in a machine readable way, and LLMs can be trained on that. Matter of fact, someone out there might create a subscription to some LLM that is constantly being updated and retrained on the latest stuff, and you're subscribing to that logic, and then you're applying it and scaling it in an automated way. Occasionally you bring in that boutique firm to make sure everything's tight, but I think the idea here is like not only bring in the expertise, but find creative ways to scale it. Starts with centralization, but then I think there's some other creative ways you can do that.
And thank you all so much. Speaking of bringing in expertise, I think we managed to do that here today. I'm really just, this was so fantastic. Thank you all so much. As we kind of come towards the top of the hour and a half here, this is a marathon session. Clearly we could keep going for 5-6 hours. Like this is just, there's so much information here to dig into. I love this so much. But for now, we're gonna start closing things off. RFC-12, the FedRAMP's continuous vulnerability management standard. You can find that at fedramp.gov right now. The close of public comment is slated for August 21. It's in the middle of the week, so nobody has to work on a weekend getting their comments together right at the end. The intent of that, so like what happens next? People always want to say, what happens next? So this is the beginning. Unlike a lot of other rules that our people are talking about right now, this is the beginning of the rule. It's not the end of the rule. So once public comment closes, we're going to take those comments. We're going to use that to kind of improve that a little bit, figure out where we miss things, where we need to explain more. And then we're going to immediately start using that as part of our FedRAMP 20X pilot, as well as head towards a Rev 5 closed beta with a few intrepid folks that want to be involved in kind of shaping that. As we go through that closed beta, which will take 2 to 3 months, you'll see us kind of coalescing towards things that are more common, right? We will learn that maybe we do need to define things a little more clearly. Maybe we need to provide a one-page framework that's tested and evaluated with some of our partners, and we'll work with that, and then we'll go to open beta. And that open beta will be a couple more months where the same thing, people have opportunity to weigh in, and then at some point, 6, 8, 9 months from now, this will become a policy that will be available for everyone on Rev 5 to switch to. And at that point in time, expect us to have a deadline set across the government that everyone will need to start implementing these tools by that time. So the thing that's coming out right now, it's not saying you need to do this next month. This is the direction that FedRAMP is going over the next year. As you bring in comment, kind of think about that. Like, you're shaping the beginning of something, not the end of something. And if you liked this session, if you enjoyed this conversation, if you have tips, feedback, thoughts, etc., feel free to send it directly to me, pete@fedramp.gov. I read all of those emails. Don't get to reply to all of them, but I try my best to. And like, we will do more of this. We will set more of these conversations up. And I think my big takeaway right now is maybe 5 people next time instead of 10 people, so we can get into more conversations. Or maybe I should have made it 4 hours. I don't know. Let me know what you think. And if this is on YouTube, like, subscribe, hit us up in the comments. Thank you all, everyone, so much for being here. Talk to you all soon. Cheers.